July 5th, 1943. The fields around Kursk, southwestern Russia. Dawn breaks over an endless sea of grass and wheat, but the beauty of the summer morning is about to be consumed by fire. Inside the cramped turret of a German Panther tank, 5 men wait in the darkness, their uniforms already soaked with sweat though the sun has barely risen. The commander peers through his periscope, scanning the horizon. The gunner tests his traverse mechanism one more time. The loader checks his ammunition racks. They know the Russians are out there, somewhere, hidden in the rolling landscape. What they don't know is that this day will mark the beginning of the largest tank battle in human history, and that their lives will soon be measured not in hours or minutes, but in seconds. The Battle of Kursk did not begin with Kursk. It began 6 months earlier, in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, where the German Sixth Army had been annihilated in a catastrophe that sent shockwaves through the Wehrmacht and changed the entire character of the war in the East. For 2 years, the German army had swept across the Soviet Union in a seemingly unstoppable tide of conquest, their panzer divisions cutting through Soviet defenses with the precision and speed that had made blitzkrieg a word synonymous with terror. But Stalingrad had broken that momentum. When the guns finally fell silent along the Volga in February 1943, more than 200,000 German soldiers were dead or captured, and the myth of German invincibility lay buried in the rubble. Yet the war was far from over. As winter gave way to spring, both sides prepared for the next great clash. The Soviets, emboldened by their victory but still wary of German power, had launched a series of offensives that pushed westward into Ukraine. By March, the front lines had stabilized into an unusual configuration. Around the city of Kursk, Soviet forces had created a massive bulge in the German lines, a salient that stretched 160 miles from north to south and protruded 100 miles westward into German-held territory. To German commanders, this bulge represented both a threat and an opportunity. It was a dagger pointed at their own positions, but it was also a trap waiting to be sprung. If they could attack from both the north and south simultaneously, they could encircle and destroy the hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops within the salient, restoring German dominance on the Eastern Front. Adolf Hitler seized upon this plan with characteristic enthusiasm. He christened it Operation Citadel and invested in it not just his military resources, but his personal prestige. This would be the offensive that proved Germany could still win in the East. This would be the battle that avenged Stalingrad. But Hitler made a fateful decision. He insisted on waiting. He wanted his newest weapons to arrive at the front first, the Tiger and Panther tanks that represented the cutting edge of German armored technology. These machines, he believed, would be decisive. Week after week, he delayed the offensive, waiting for more tanks to roll off the production lines. May became June. June became July. And with every passing week, the Soviets grew stronger, because the Soviets knew what was coming. Through a combination of brilliant intelligence work, captured German documents, and British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, who passed along decrypted German communications, Soviet commanders had a remarkably clear picture of German plans. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the hero of Moscow and Stalingrad, argued forcefully for a defensive strategy. Let the Germans come, he urged Stalin. Let them break themselves against prepared positions. Then, when they were exhausted and overextended, the Red Army would counterattack. Stalin, who had often favored bold offensives over cautious defense, this time agreed. The decision would shape everything that followed. Throughout the spring of 1943, the Kursk salient was transformed into perhaps the most formidable defensive position ever constructed. 300,000 civilians were mobilized alongside Red Army engineers to dig thousands of miles of trenches arranged in crisscrossing patterns. They built anti-tank ditches deep enough to swallow a panzer. They constructed bunkers and firing positions from which Soviet infantry could engage German tanks at close range. And they laid mines, hundreds of thousands of them, more than 943,000 in total, creating minefields with densities 6 times greater than those used in the defense of Moscow. In some sectors, there were 2,500 anti-personnel mines and 2,200 anti-tank mines per kilometer of front. The defenses were arranged in depth, with 6 major defensive belts stretching nearly 200 miles from the front line to the rear areas. If the Germans broke through one belt, they would immediately encounter another, And behind all of this, held in reserve and ready to strike, were fresh armies including the 5th Guards Tank Army, equipped with hundreds of T-34 medium tanks. The T-34 was not the most sophisticated tank on the battlefield at Kursk. It lacked the thick armor of the German Tiger or the long-range firepower of the Panther. The original version carried a 76.2mm gun that struggled against the upper-moored Panzer IVs that now equipped many German formations. And the frontal armor of Tigers and Panthers was essentially impenetrable to this weapon at normal combat ranges. The T-34's turret was cramped, forcing the tank commander to double as the gunner, which severely limited situational awareness. Visibility was poor, communication systems were often unreliable, and crew comfort was non-existent. Soviet tankers fought in conditions that would have been considered intolerable by their German counterparts. But the T-34 had advantages that would prove decisive. It was fast, maneuverable, and reliable. Most importantly, Soviet factories could produce them in vast numbers. While German industry struggled to manufacture a few hundred Panthers and Tigers, Soviet plants east of the Ural Mountains were churning out thousands of T-34s. This asymmetry would define the battle to come. By the time the Germans launched Operation Citadel, they had assembled a force of staggering power. Nearly 780,000 men, representing 70% of all German armor on the Eastern Front, were concentrated for the attack. They deployed approximately 2,700 tanks and assault guns, including 200 of the new Panther medium tanks, 146 Tiger heavy tanks, and 90 Ferdinand self-propelled tank destroyers. These were some of the most powerful armored fighting vehicles in the world. The Tiger, with its 88mm gun and thick armor, could destroy a T-34 at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters while remaining virtually immune to return fire. The Panther combined heavy firepower with better mobility than the Tiger and was intended to replace older German tanks entirely. The Ferdinand, mounting the same 88mm gun as the Tiger, but with even heavier armor, was designed to be an impregnable fortress on tracks. Yet these impressive statistics masked serious problems. Many of the Panther crews were fresh from training, with little combat experience and almost no time to train together as units. The Panthers themselves rushed into service before their mechanical problems were fully resolved, began breaking down even before the battle started. By the morning of July 5th, 16 Panthers had already been lost to mechanical failure. The German army also faced a more fundamental problem. Despite their concentration of armor, they lacked sufficient infantry divisions to hold ground and protect the flanks of their armored spearheads. They were committing to a battle of attrition against an enemy that outnumbered them 2-1, with a Soviet force of 1.9 million men, nearly 5,000 tanks, and more than 31,000 artillery pieces waiting in the salient. The battle began not with a German artillery barrage, but with a Soviet one. On the evening of July 4th, a captured German soldier revealed the exact timing of the planned offensive. At 2:30 in the morning on July 5th, Soviet artillery opened fire across the entire front, attempting to disrupt German assembly areas. The bombardment was largely ineffective, falling on positions the Germans had already vacated. But it announced to everyone that the great confrontation had begun. Hours later, as dawn broke, the Germans launched their own massive artillery preparation. Then the tanks began to move. In the north, Field Marshal Walter Model's 9th Army pushed southward with 10 divisions led by Tiger heavy tanks. Almost immediately, they ran into trouble. The minefields were far denser than expected. Tanks that struck mines had their tracks blown off, requiring crews to spend an hour or more making repairs under fire, assuming the damage could be repaired at all. German combat engineers worked frantically to clear paths, sometimes employing radio-controlled demolition vehicles to detonate mines ahead of the advancing armor. But progress was agonizingly slow. Soviet anti-tank guns, positioned in depth and carefully camouflaged, opened fire on the German columns. Soviet artillery, including the massive 152mm howitzers that could fire a shell every 15 seconds, pounded German positions. By the end of the first day, Model's forces had advanced only 6 miles into Soviet defenses, at a cost of 25,000 casualties and 200 tanks. In the south, General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, spearheaded by elite Waffen-SS divisions, made better initial progress. They employed a new tactic called the Panzerkeil, or tank wedge, placing their heaviest Tigers at the front of their formations to absorb Soviet anti-tank fire, while the more vulnerable Panzer IIIs and IVs followed behind. This allowed them to penetrate deeper into Soviet lines, breaking through the first defensive belt and advancing toward the town of Oboyan. But every mile was bought with blood and steel. Soviet defenders fought with a determination that surprised German commanders. Anti-tank rifle teams crept close to German tanks, targeting vision ports and weaker side armor. Soviet infantry, trained to overcome their fear of tanks by having them driven over their trenches during exercises, held their positions even as German armor rolled past. And Soviet tanks, carefully positioned in hull-down positions or hidden in villages, waited for the right moment to strike. The fundamental tactical problem facing the Soviets was clear. The T-34's 76.2mm gun simply could not penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger or Panther at ranges where German tanks could engage with impunity. Soviet tankers called encounters with Tigers at long range suicidal. A Tiger's 88mm gun could destroy a T-34 with a single shot from more than a mile away, while the T-34 shells would simply bounce off the Tiger's thick frontal plates. The technical superiority of the German heavy tanks was so overwhelming that in some early encounters, small numbers of Tigers destroyed entire Soviet tank formations without suffering any damage themselves. There are reports of individual Tiger crews claiming dozens of kills in a single engagement. The most famous of these was SS Untersturmführer Michael Wittmann, who would go on to become the highest-scoring tank ace of the war. But Soviet commanders understood the limitations of their equipment, and they developed tactics to counter it. If they couldn't penetrate German armor at range, they would close the distance. They would force the battle into a close-quarters brawl where the T-34's advantages in speed and maneuverability could offset the German advantages in firepower and protection. This was not a new idea. Soviet tankers had been employing close-range tactics since 1941. But at Kursk, it would be refined and employed on an unprecedented scale. The orders given to Soviet tank commanders were clear. Do not engage German heavy tanks at long range. Use terrain, smoke, and speed to close the distance. Get within 200 meters, ideally closer. At those ranges, the sides and rear of even the mightiest German tanks became vulnerable. At those ranges, there was no time for the German commander to calmly select a target, no time for the gunner to make precise calculations, no time for the loader to carefully select the right type of ammunition. At those ranges, survival became a matter of reflexes and split-second decisions. The climax came on July 12th, near the small village of Prokhorovka, southeast of Kursk. By this point, the German offensive in the north had stalled completely, ground down by Soviet defenses and counterattacks. But in the south, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, consisting of the elite Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, was still pushing forward. They had broken through the 2nd defensive belt and were threatening to penetrate the 3rd and final prepared line. Soviet commanders recognized this as the crisis point of the entire battle. If the Germans broke through here, they might still achieve their objective of cutting off and destroying the forces in the salient. Marshal Nikolai Vatutin, commanding the Voronezh front, ordered the 5th Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rotmistrov to attack immediately. Do not wait. Do not allow the Germans to consolidate their positions. Attack now, with everything. What followed was chaos on a scale rarely seen, even in the brutal warfare of the Eastern Front. Early on the morning of July 12th, as fog began to lift from the fields around Prokhorovka, hundreds of Soviet T-34s and lighter T-70 tanks charged forward in waves. They advanced at high speed, sometimes with infantry riding on top of their hulls, straight toward the German positions. The Soviet plan was simple and desperate. Close the range as quickly as possible. Get inside the German formations. Force a melee where the Tigers' long-range advantage became meaningless. The tactical orders given to Soviet tank commanders reflected this approach. Move fast. Don't stop to return fire until you're close. Aim for the sides and rear. In the close quarters fighting that was about to unfold, everything would depend on speed, aggression, and the ability to make split-second decisions. The German crews saw them coming. Through their superior optics, German tank commanders could see the dark shapes of Soviet tanks emerging from the morning haze advancing across the open steppe at full speed. The Tigers and Panthers immediately opened fire at ranges of 1,000 meters or more. Their 88mm and 75mm guns were devastatingly effective. Soviet tanks began to explode and burn across the battlefield. Columns of thick black smoke rose into the sky, but the Soviets kept coming. They didn't slow down. They didn't stop to return fire. They drove straight into the German positions, accepting horrific casualties in order to close the range. Within minutes, the battle had transformed from a long-range gunnery exercise into a swirling, chaotic, close-range engagement, unlike anything most of the participants had ever experienced. Inside the German tanks, the crews suddenly found themselves in a nightmare. Enemy tanks that had been distant targets moments before were now appearing at close range from multiple directions. The excellent German optics and long-range gunnery that had given them such an advantage became less important. What mattered now was situational awareness, the ability to identify threats quickly, and above all, speed. The tank commander had to spot incoming enemy vehicles, often through limited vision slits in his cupola, while also coordinating his own crew and maintaining radio contact with other tanks in his platoon. The gunner had to traverse the turret, which on a Tiger weighed several tons and took time to rotate even with power assistance, especially if the tank was on uneven ground or moving. He had to acquire the target in his sights, which was difficult when both vehicles were moving and visibility was obscured by dust and smoke. The loader had to select the right type of shell, extract it from the ammunition rack, and load it into the breech, a process that required both strength and precision in the cramped confines of the turret. All of this took time. In the open, long-range engagements that German tank doctrine favored, there was usually enough time to go through these steps methodically. But when a T-34 appeared suddenly at 200 meters, charging forward at 30 miles per hour through clouds of dust and smoke, time collapsed. Veterans of the battle would later recall that from the moment a Soviet tank was spotted at close range to the moment it fired, German crews had approximately 8 seconds to react, 8 seconds to spot the threat, 8 seconds to traverse the turret, 8 seconds to acquire the target, 8 seconds to load and fire, 8 seconds before the roles reversed and the Soviet gunner had his shot. 8 seconds does not sound like much, and indeed it was not. But for a well-trained and experienced crew, 8 seconds could be enough. The commander would shout target information, often using a simple clock face system to indicate direction. Tank! 11 o'clock! 200 meters! The gunner would immediately begin traversing the turret in that direction while peering through his sight, searching for the target. The instant he acquired it, he would fire, often without taking time to make precise aim adjustments. At such close ranges, precise aiming was less critical than speed. The loader would already be pulling another shell from the rack, preparing for a second shot. If everything went perfectly, if the turret was already facing roughly the right direction, if the loader was fast, if the gunner's reflexes were sharp, a German tank could get off a shot in those 8 seconds. And at close range, that shot would likely be fatal to the T-34. The Tiger's 88mm shell, striking the side or rear armor of a T-34, would punch through the relatively thin plates and detonate inside the crew compartment, killing the crew instantly and often causing the tank's ammunition to explode in a catastrophic fireball. But if anything went wrong, if the turret was facing the wrong direction and had to traverse 90 degrees or more, if the loader was caught off guard and fumbled with a heavy shell, if the gunner couldn't acquire the target quickly through the smoke and dust, if the tank was moving over rough ground and the stabilization was poor, then those 8 seconds would elapse, and the Soviet gunner would have his chance. The T-34's 76.2mm gun, ineffective against the Tiger's frontal armor, could penetrate the side armor at close range. And unlike the T-34, which had relatively well-sloped armor that could sometimes deflect hits even from powerful guns, the Tiger's sides were more vulnerable. A hit on the side could penetrate through to the engine compartment, starting a fire. It could strike the ammunition storage, causing a catastrophic explosion. It could kill or wound members of the crew. Even a hit that didn't penetrate could damage vision devices, jam the turret traverse mechanism, or injure the crew through spalling, metal fragments that broke off from the inside of the armor and ricocheted through the crew compartment like shrapnel. The fighting around Prokhorovka on July 12th saw hundreds of these desperate close-range engagements playing out simultaneously across a front several miles wide. The battlefield was obscured by dust thrown up by churning tank treads and by smoke from burning vehicles and artillery shells. Visibility was measured in dozens of meters at best. Soviet and German tanks sometimes collided with each other in the chaos. There are reports of tanks firing at each other at ranges of 50 meters or less, point blank by any standard. The noise was deafening. The 88mm gun of a Tiger produced a tremendous blast in recoil. The sound of shells striking armor, sometimes penetrating with a sharp crack, sometimes deflecting with a ringing clang, mixed with the roar of engines, the rattle of machine guns, and the screams of wounded men. The temperature inside the tanks climbed to unbearable levels. It was 40 degrees Celsius outside, and inside the steel boxes, with engines running at full power and the sun beating down on metal hulls, temperatures soared past 50 degrees. Crews fought soaked in sweat, struggling to breathe air thick with gun smoke and fumes. The combat was not just between tanks. Soviet infantry, fighting alongside their armor, used every weapon at their disposal. Anti-tank rifle teams, armed with 14.5mm rifles that could penetrate thinner armor at close range, targeted vision ports in the weaker rear armor of German tanks. Soviet combat engineers crawled close to disabled German vehicles and placed magnetic mines on their hulls. Soviet artillery, firing over open sights at times, engaged German tanks directly. German infantry, in turn, fought desperately to protect their armor from Soviet tank hunting teams. The Ferdinands, those massive tank destroyers with their powerful 88mm guns and thick frontal armor, proved surprisingly vulnerable in close combat. They had limited gun traverse and, critically, no machine guns for self-defense against infantry. Soviet soldiers discovered they could approach Ferdinands from the sides or rear and attack them with relative impunity. Of the 90 Ferdinands that participated in the battle, only 50 would survive to return to Germany. The Panthers, Germany's newest medium tank, also suffered. Despite their impressive technical specifications, they were plagued by mechanical problems throughout the battle. Engines overheated, transmissions failed, fuel lines ruptured, causing fires. Crews who had minimal training time struggled to use their vehicles effectively under combat conditions. Many Panthers were lost not to Soviet fire, but to breakdown, abandoned when they could not be recovered from the battlefield. The Tigers, more reliable and crewed by experienced tankers, performed better. But even they were not invulnerable. In the close-range fighting, their advantages diminished. Several Tigers were disabled or destroyed at Prokhorovka, though the exact numbers remain disputed among historians. What is clear is that the Soviet tactics worked. By closing the range and forcing a chaotic melee, they had nullified much of the German technical superiority. The human cost was staggering. Soviet tank losses at Prokhorovka were enormous. Hundreds of T-34s and T-70s were destroyed in a single day. Entire tank brigades were effectively wiped out. The 181st Tank Regiment, ordered to charge directly at a group of Tigers, was annihilated without destroying a single German heavy tank. Soviet casualties in the broader Battle of Kursk would eventually exceed 800,000 men, with estimates of tank losses ranging from 1,600 to several thousand, depending on how they are counted. These losses were higher than German casualties, which totaled approximately 200,000 men and between 300 and 500 tanks in the main phase of the battle. In purely tactical terms, the Germans inflicted more damage than they received. But in strategic terms, this meant nothing. Because the crucial fact was that the Germans had failed. Despite their technological superiority, despite the skill of their tank crews, despite weeks of offensive operations that penetrated deep into Soviet defenses, they had not achieved a breakthrough. The third defensive belt around Prokhorovka held. The Soviet armies in the Kursk salient were not encircled. The Germans had lost irreplaceable tanks and experienced crew members in exchange for a few miles of ground. And now, with their offensive stalled, they faced a new crisis. On July 10th, Allied forces had landed in Sicily, threatening Italy and forcing Hitler to consider withdrawing forces from the Eastern Front. More immediately, the Soviets were about to counterattack. On July 12th, the same day as the fighting at Prokhorovka, Soviet forces launched Operation Kutuzov against the northern face of the German offensive. Hundreds of thousands of fresh Soviet troops held in reserve throughout the German attack now went over to the offensive. The Germans, exhausted and depleted by weeks of combat, began to fall back. In the south, despite pleas from Field Marshal Erich von Manstein that one more push could achieve victory, Hitler ordered a halt to offensive operations. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps would be withdrawn and sent to Italy. Operation Citadel was over. The great German gamble had failed. The Soviets did not stop. Throughout the rest of July and into August, they pressed their counteroffensives. Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev was launched against the southern face of the salient on August 3rd. One by one, the cities that the Germans had fought so hard to hold fell back into Soviet hands. Orel was liberated on August 5th. Belgorod fell the same day. Kharkov, which had changed hands multiple times already in the war, was finally retaken by Soviet forces on August 23rd. By that date, the Battle of Kursk was officially over. The Germans had been pushed back to their starting positions and beyond. The salient had been eliminated not by German offensive action, but by Soviet counterattack. And the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front had permanently shifted. Never again would the Germans launch a major offensive in the east. From Kursk forward, they would be in retreat. The fields around Kursk were left littered with the burned-out hulks of hundreds of tanks from both sides. Twisted metal, blackened and still smoking, marked the spots where crews had fought and died. The ground was churned up by tracks and cratered by artillery shells. Unexploded mines remained buried, a danger that would persist for decades. The scale of destruction was so vast that even Soviet propaganda, usually eager to emphasize German losses, struggled to comprehend it. Soviet tanker Lev Nikolaevich Malinovsky, writing to his brother from the battlefield, described fighting that lasted 5 hours in which his unit destroyed 21 German tanks. His uniform was soaked through with sweat. He was too exhausted to eat when food was finally brought forward. This was just one engagement in one sector on one day. Such encounters were repeated thousands of times across the vast Kursk battlefield. For the tank crews who survived, both German and Soviet, the memories of Kursk would never fade. They remembered the heat, the crushing fear, the deafening noise, the sight of fellow tankers burning to death in vehicles that became steel coffins. Soviet crews remembered the terror of charging across open ground toward German positions, knowing that at any moment an 88mm shell might end their lives. German crews remembered the moment when Soviet tanks suddenly appeared through the smoke at close range, and everything depended on those desperate 8 seconds. Some crews made it, some did not. The line between life and death was often a matter of inches or fractions of a second. A shell that struck a few inches to the left instead of center might deflect harmlessly off sloped armor. A gunner who was a second faster than his opponent would survive while his enemy died. Luck, skill, terrain, mechanical reliability, crew coordination, all of these factors mattered. But in the close-range fighting that characterized so much of Kursk, time mattered most of all. The strategic impact of the Battle of Kursk was profound and lasting. Germany's panzer forces, which had once seemed invincible, had been bled white in the salient. They had lost not just tanks, which could theoretically be replaced given time and resources, but experienced crews who could not be replaced. The Tiger aces, the veteran commanders who knew how to employ armor effectively, were increasingly rare as casualties mounted. More fundamentally, the Germans had lost something intangible but crucial. They had lost the belief that they could win. Kursk had been conceived as the operation that would restore German dominance in the East. Its failure proved that even with technological superiority, even with the best tanks in the world, Germany could not defeat the Soviet Union. The Red Army had absorbed everything the Wehrmacht could throw at it and had struck back harder. From this point forward, German strategy in the East would be purely defensive, trading space for time, falling back in the desperate hope that the advancing Soviets could somehow be stopped before they reached the borders of the Reich itself. That hope would prove futile. For the Soviet Union, Kursk validated the approach that Zhukov and other commanders had advocated. Prepared defenses in depth, combined with massive reserves and the willingness to accept high casualties, could stop even the most powerful German offensives. The Red Army's ability to produce tanks in vast numbers, to replace losses that would have crippled a smaller nation, had proven decisive. Soviet factories would go on to produce more than 50,000 T-34s during the war, an astonishing number that no other nation could match. This productive capacity, combined with improving tactical skills and growing confidence among Soviet commanders and crews, would drive the Red Army westward across Ukraine, through Poland, and eventually into Germany itself. The road to Berlin, in a very real sense, began at Kursk. The technological lessons of the battle were also significant. The Germans recognized that their medium tanks, the Panzer IIIs and IVs that formed the bulk of their armored forces, were becoming obsolete. The Panther, despite its teething troubles at Kursk, would eventually become an excellent tank once its mechanical problems were resolved. But Germany could never produce them in the numbers needed. Soviet designers, meanwhile, recognized that the T-34's 76.2mm gun was no longer adequate. Development of an improved version, the T-34-85, with an 85mm gun capable of engaging German heavy tanks more effectively at range, accelerated after Kursk. The arms race in tank design would continue for the rest of the war, with each side trying to build heavier armor and mount larger guns. But the fundamental reality that Kursk had demonstrated remained unchanged. In total war, production capacity and the ability to sustain losses mattered as much as technical quality. The best tank in the world was useless if you didn't have enough of them, or enough fuel to operate them, or enough trained crews to man them. In the decades since 1943, the Battle of Kursk has become legendary, sometimes to the point where myth has obscured reality. For many years, particularly in Soviet accounts, Prokhorovka was described as a straightforward Soviet victory in which 1,500 tanks participated. More recent research, with access to German archives that were classified until the 1980s, has shown that the numbers were smaller and the outcome more ambiguous. The Germans destroyed far more Soviet tanks than they lost, but this tactical reality did not translate into strategic success. The German offensive still failed. The Soviets still drove them back. The focus on tank versus tank combat, while dramatic, also obscures the fact that most tank losses at Kursk, on both sides, were caused not by other tanks but by mines, anti-tank guns, and artillery. The romantic image of dueling tanks needs to be balanced against the reality of combined arms warfare in which infantry, artillery, air power, and logistics all played crucial roles. Yet the tank battles remain compelling because they capture something essential about the nature of armored warfare. Unlike infantry combat, which often involved large numbers of soldiers acting collectively, tank combat came down to small crews enclosed in their vehicles, fighting desperate individual duels. The fate of 5 or 6 men depended entirely on their own actions, their coordination as a crew, and their ability to make decisions faster than the enemy. This created a unique psychological pressure. There was no hiding behind cover, no blending into a mass of other soldiers. When your tank was hit, you either escaped or you burned. The crews on both sides understood this with perfect clarity. They knew that every time they went into combat, they might not come back. Yet they climbed into their tanks and did their duty regardless. The image of those 8 seconds has resonated precisely because it captures the essence of what tank combat at close range meant. 8 seconds was enough time to think, to act, to coordinate with your crew. It was enough time for a skilled gunner to acquire a target and fire, but it was not enough time for hesitation, for second-guessing, for fear to paralyze you. In those 8 seconds, training, experience, and instinct took over. Veteran crews who had fought together for months, who knew each other's rhythms and could anticipate each other's actions, had an enormous advantage over inexperienced replacements still learning to work together. This was one reason why the loss of experienced crews hurt the Germans so badly. You could build a new Tiger in a few months. You could not create an experienced Tiger crew in the same time frame. For the individual soldiers who fought at Kursk, whether they were German panzer crewmen or Soviet tankisti, the battle was not about grand strategy or historical turning points. It was about survival, about getting through the next hour, the next minute, the next 8 seconds. It was about the terrifying thunder of an 88mm gun firing, the smell of cordite and burning flesh, The sight of a friendly tank exploding in a ball of fire, the knowledge that the next shell might have your name on it. Many broke under the strain. Some German crews, after days of continuous combat in the sweltering heat, were found to be too exhausted to continue. Soviet crews, who often fought until their tanks were destroyed, suffered casualty rates that would have destroyed the morale of most armies. Yet they kept fighting. There is something both heroic and tragic in this persistence, in the willingness of young men to climb into their steel coffins and drive toward the enemy one more time. When the dust finally settled and the guns fell silent, what remained was devastation. The Kursk salient had seen more than 2 million men locked in combat, nearly 6,000 tanks deployed, thousands of aircraft engaged. The death toll was enormous on both sides. The landscape was scarred in ways that are still visible decades later. But beyond the immediate human and material costs, Kursk had changed the war. It had demonstrated beyond any doubt that Germany could not achieve victory in the East through offensive action. It had proven that the Red Army, once dismissed by Hitler and his generals as a primitive horde that would collapse under the first serious blow, was now a sophisticated and powerful military force capable of defeating the best the Wehrmacht could field. And it had set in motion the great Soviet offensives that would roll westward over the next 2 years, liberating the Soviet Union, crushing Germany's allies in Eastern Europe, and ultimately capturing Berlin. For Germany, Kursk was the last gasp of strategic ambition in the East. After July 1943, every German action on the Eastern Front would be reactive, defensive, desperate. They would win tactical victories, hold certain positions longer than seemed possible, and inflict terrible casualties on the advancing Soviets. But they would never again seize the initiative. They would never again believe they could win. For the Soviet Union, Kursk was validation. It proved that the sacrifices of 1941 and 1942, the terrible losses sustained during the initial German invasion, and the battles for Moscow and Stalingrad had not been in vain. The Red Army had survived its trial by fire and emerged stronger. Soviet soldiers and commanders, who had spent 2 years learning the hard lessons of modern warfare at a terrible cost, now possessed the skill and confidence to match their determination. And they had the weapons, the T-34s pouring out of factories in the Urals by the thousands, to sustain a long offensive campaign all the way to the heart of Germany. Historians continue to debate the details of the Battle of Kursk. They argue about casualty figures, about whether Prokhorovka was really the largest tank battle in history, or whether earlier engagements in 1941 were larger. They examine newly available archives and revise their understanding of specific actions. But the fundamental significance of the battle remains undisputed. Kursk was a turning point, perhaps the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. After Kursk, Germany was doomed. Not immediately and not without enormous additional bloodshed, but doomed nonetheless. The path to German defeat, which began at Moscow and continued through Stalingrad, became irreversible at Kursk. For the men who fought in those desperate, close-range tank engagements, for the German crews who had 8 seconds to react when a T-34 suddenly appeared through the smoke, for the Soviet crews who charged across open ground, knowing they might be dead in moments, the battle was not about historical significance or strategic turning points. It was about those 8 seconds, about the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death, about the desperate struggle to spot the enemy first, to traverse the turret faster, to fire before the other man fired. Some succeeded, many did not. Their names are largely forgotten now, remembered only on memorials scattered across the Russian countryside. But they were there, in the heat and smoke and terror of the largest tank battle in history, and their actions decided the fate of nations. The fields around Kursk are quiet now. The wheat grows tall where tanks once burned. The villages have been rebuilt. The mines have mostly been cleared, though occasionally a farmer still unearths rusted metal from that terrible summer. Monuments stand where the fighting was fiercest, granite testaments to men who died in machines. Veterans, those few who survived into old age, would sometimes return to walk those fields, remembering friends who never left. They would stand in the summer sun, 80 years old, and for a moment be 20 again, hearing the roar of engines, feeling the fear, living once more through those 8 seconds that changed everything. The last of them are gone now. the German tank commanders who peered through their optics and shouted target coordinates, the Soviet drivers who pushed their throttles forward and charged toward the enemy, the loaders who hefted shells with trembling hands, the gunners who had 8 seconds to aim and fire. They carried their memories to the grave, memories of heat and smoke and terror, of friends who died beside them, of the thin line between survival and oblivion. What remains is history, and the lesson burned into the earth at Kursk in the summer of 1943. That technological superiority alone cannot win wars. That courage and determination, however costly, can overcome seemingly impossible odds. That in the end, the side that can endure the most, that can replace its losses and continue fighting, will prevail. And that sometimes in war, everything comes down to a handful of seconds, to the choices made in moments of desperate clarity when there is no time to think, only to act. 8 seconds. For some it was enough. For others it was an eternity that ended in fire. For all of them, it was the moment that mattered most.